The rangemaster looked at the old man in the red jacket and shook his head. "Sir, this is a military training facility. Civilians aren't allowed past this point." The words cut through the crisp morning air as 70-year-old Thomas Hayes stood at the entrance to the rifle range, his white beard catching the early sunlight. His sad, serious eyes didn't waver. "I was asked to come," he said quietly. Rangemaster's expression hardened. "By who?" "Look, I don't know what you think you're doing here, but we have live fire exercises today. This isn't a place for spectators." Thomas reached into his jacket pocket, but the rangemaster stepped forward, hand raised. "Don't bother showing me whatever you've got. Rules are rules. You need to leave now." Behind them, the crack of rifle fire echoed across the range. Somewhere in that controlled chaos, a young cadet was about to face a moment that would test everything he thought he knew. Thomas Hayes had lived in the small town near Fort Braxton for 15 years, ever since his wife passed. He kept to himself mostly, living in a modest apartment above the old hardware store on Main Street. His red jacket had seen better days, the fabric worn at the elbows, but he wore it every day over whatever plain shirt he had clean. People in town knew him as the quiet old man who sometimes sat in the park, feeding pigeons, watching the world go by with those perpetually sad eyes. They didn't know much else. He didn't talk about his past. He didn't wear his service on his sleeve. When Veterans Day came around each year, he stayed home. When the local VFW invited him to their gatherings, he politely declined. The silence he carried wasn't shame. It was something deeper. Something that had settled into his bones over decades, a weight that only those who had truly seen combat could understand. That morning, Thomas had received a phone call, a voice he hadn't heard in 40 years. Colonel James Morrison, now the commanding officer at Fort Braxton, had tracked him down. "Tom," the voice had said, rough with emotion and time, "I need you. We have a situation." A young instructor, barely 30, thinks he knows everything there is to know about firearms training. He's putting cadets at risk with his arrogance. I've tried talking to him, but he won't listen. He needs to see something. He needs to meet someone who understands what real training means, what real consequences look like. Thomas had wanted to refuse. He'd spent years building walls around those memories. But Morrison had been there. Morrison had been in the jungle with him. Morrison had seen what happened when training failed. "Please, Tom, just come to the range tomorrow morning. Just be there." So he'd come. And now he stood at the gate, being turned away by a rangemaster who saw nothing but an old man in a worn jacket. "I'm not asking to interfere," Thomas said, his voice still quiet but firm. "Colonel Morrison requested my presence." The rangemaster laughed a short, sharp sound. "Colonel Morrison? Right. And I'm the Secretary of Defense. Look, old-timer, I don't know what game you're playing, but you need to move along before I have security escort you out." Thomas nodded slowly, that sad expression never changing. He turned to leave, his shoulders slightly hunched, looking every bit the defeated old man the rangemaster assumed he was. But then a voice crackled over the rangemaster's radio. "This is Control. We have a code red on Lane 7, cadet weapon malfunction. Round-chambered instructor is not responding appropriately to the situation." The rangemaster's face went pale. He pressed the radio to his mouth. "Say again, Control. What do you mean not responding appropriately?" The radio crackled. "Instructor Daniels is attempting to clear the weapon himself. He's arguing with the cadet. Sir, the cadet is panicking. This is escalating." The rangemaster started running toward the range, then stopped, looking back at Thomas. Something in the old man's eyes had changed. They were still sad, still serious, but there was something else there now. Something that looked like recognition, like he'd seen this exact scenario before. "You," the rangemaster said, breathing hard. "You," said Morrison called you. "You're not just some civilian, are you?" Thomas didn't answer with words. He simply started walking toward the range, his pace steady, purposeful. The shuffle was gone from his step. On lane 7, 20-year-old cadet Marcus Webb was frozen in terror. The M16 in his hands had jammed during a rapid-fire drill, and he could feel the rounds still in the chamber. He'd followed procedure called ceasefire, kept the weapon pointed downrange. But Instructor Daniels, a former Army Ranger who'd served one tour and thought that made him invincible, had stormed over, red-faced and angry. "What kind of incompetent handling is this, cadet?" Daniels shouted. "Give me that weapon. I'll show you how it's done." Marcus's hands were shaking. "Sir, the manual says to wait for the armourer when there's a chambered round and a jam, sir. I don't think—" Daniels grabbed for the rifle. "I don't care what the manual says. I've cleared 1,000 jams in the field. Hand it over." But Marcus held on, his training warring with his instinct to obey a superior officer. The other cadets on the line had stopped firing, watching in horror as their instructor and their fellow cadet struggled over a loaded weapon with a compromised mechanism. That's when Thomas Hayes walked onto the range. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply walked with the steady, measured pace of someone who had been in 1,000 situations exactly like this one. Someone who knew that panic was the real enemy. The range master was behind him, speaking urgently into his radio, but Thomas's focus was entirely on lane 7. He could see it all unfolding like a slow-motion nightmare, the instructor's ego overriding his training. The cadet's fear, making his grip unsteady, the weapon between them, a disaster waiting to happen. Thomas had seen a man die from a similar situation in 1968, a training accident that never should have happened. A young Marine who'd frozen, an overconfident sergeant who'd grabbed the weapon wrong, and a trigger that caught on a piece of equipment. The sound of that shot still echoed in Thomas's dreams. "Step back from the weapon." Thomas's voice cut across the range, not loud, but carrying absolute authority. Instructor Daniels spun around, still gripping the rifle. "Who the hell are you? This is a restricted area. Range master, get this civilian off my range." But Marcus Webb's eyes had locked onto the old man in the red jacket. There was something in that weathered face, something in those sad, serious eyes that spoke of experience beyond anything Daniels could imagine. Thomas walked closer, his hands visible and open at his sides. "Son," he said to Marcus, his voice gentle now, "you did the right thing. You followed your training. Now, I need you to do exactly as I say. Can you do that?" Marcus nodded, tears of relief starting to form. "Yes, sir." Daniels' face was purple with rage. "I'm in charge here. You have no authority." "Let go of the rifle," Thomas said. And this time there was steel in his quiet voice. "Let go right now, or that cadet's blood will be on your hands." Daniels' hands fell away as if burned. Thomas moved forward, positioning himself beside Marcus. "Okay, son, keep it pointed downrange. That's good. Now, I'm going to place my hands over yours. Not taking the weapon, just guiding. Is the selector on safe?" Marcus's voice cracked. "I tried, sir, but it won't move. I think that's part of the jam." Thomas nodded, his white beard brushing against his chest as he looked down at the mechanism. "All right, that happens. Means there's pressure on the sear. We're going to relieve that pressure very, very slowly. I'm going to reach around and support the bolt carrier. You're going to maintain your grip exactly as it is. We're going to work together." His hands, weathered and marked with old scars, moved with absolute certainty. No wasted motion. No hesitation. He'd cleared jams under enemy fire. He taught weapons safety to Marines who went on to teach others. This was muscle memory written in decades of experience. The range had gone completely silent. Every cadet, every instructor, every range officer was watching the old man in the red jacket work, with a calmness that seemed to slow time itself. Thomas's fingers found the charging handle, applied precise pressure. "Marcus, on my count, you're going to ease your trigger finger position. Not pulling, just shifting slightly. 3, 2, 1. There was a soft click. The tension in the mechanism released. Thomas carefully worked the charging handle, ejecting the jammed round onto the ground in front of them. He guided Marcus through locking the bolt to the rear, then removing the magazine. Only then did he step back. "Clear and safe," he said quietly. Marcus was shaking so hard he could barely stand. Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did good, son. You followed your training. That's what saved us here." Instructor Daniels had gone from purple to white. He stared at the ejected round on the ground, at the rifle now rendered safe, at the old man who had done in 30 seconds what his ego had almost turned into a tragedy. "Who are you?" he whispered. Before Thomas could answer, a vehicle pulled up behind them. Colonel James Morrison stepped out, his uniform crisp, his bearing that of a man who'd commanded thousands. But when he looked at Thomas Hayes, his eyes were wet. "Attention!" Morrison's voice rang out, and every person on that range snapped to. Morrison walked slowly to Thomas, and then in front of everyone the colonel came to attention and rendered a sharp, precise salute. "Sergeant Major," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "it's been too long." Thomas returned the salute. That same sad, serious expression on his face, but now everyone could see what it really was. Not weakness, not defeat, it was the weight of service. The burden of having seen too much, done too much, survived when others hadn't. Morrison turned to address the assembled personnel. "This man," he said, pointing to Thomas, "is Sergeant Major Thomas Hayes, United States Marine Corps, retired. He served 3 tours in Vietnam. He was the senior enlisted advisor for weapons training at Quantico for 12 years. He personally developed half the safety protocols we still use today. He trained thousands of Marines, and his methods, his insistence on safety over speed, his refusal to let ego override procedure, saved countless lives." Morrison's voice grew harder as he looked at Instructor Daniels. "He's also the man I called yesterday and begged to come here because I've been hearing reports about shortcuts, about arrogance, about an instructor who thinks his one deployment makes him an expert." Daniels couldn't meet anyone's eyes. He stared at the ground, his face burning with shame. Morrison continued, "What you just witnessed is what real expertise looks like. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need to prove itself. It simply knows, and it acts with precision born from experience." He turned back to Thomas. "I'm sorry they turned you away at the gate. I'm sorry you had to witness this situation, but I'm grateful you were here." Thomas shook his head slowly. "Jim, I'm just glad the boy is safe. That's all that matters." Marcus Webb stepped forward, still shaking slightly. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you." I froze. I didn't know what to do when he grabbed. "You did exactly right," Thomas interrupted gently. "You held your ground. You remembered your training. That took more courage than clearing the jam did. Don't ever doubt that." Morrison placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Tom, I have a request. I know you've stayed away from all this for years. I know you have your reasons, but we need you, not just for today. These cadets, these young instructors, they need to learn from someone who understands that every weapon, every round, every moment on a range carries life or death consequences. Would you consider coming back, even just once a week? Share your knowledge, help us build the kind of culture where what almost happened today never happens again." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his sad eyes scanning the faces of the young cadets watching him. He saw himself in them decades ago, young and uncertain and trying so hard to prove himself. He saw the Marines he trained, some of whom had come home, some of whom hadn't. He saw the responsibility that came with knowledge, with experience, with having survived long enough to know better. "I'll come," he said finally. "But on one condition. We do this right. No shortcuts. No ego. Safety first, always. And anyone who can't accept that doesn't belong on a range." Morrison smiled, the first real smile he'd shown all day. Agreed. Completely agreed. He turned to the assembled personnel. From this moment forward, Sergeant Major Hayes has full authority on this range. His word is law. His protocols will be followed to the letter. Is that understood? A chorus of, "Yes, sir," rang out across the range. Daniels stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sergeant Major, I owe you an apology. I owe Cadet Webb an apology. I let my pride nearly cause a tragedy. If you're willing to teach me, I'm willing to learn." Thomas studied him for a moment, those serious eyes seeming to look right through him. Then he nodded. "Pride is easy to find, son. Humility is harder, but it's humility that keeps people alive. You're young. You have time to learn. If you're willing to put in the work, I'll help you." Over the following weeks, Thomas Hayes became a fixture at Fort Braxton. He arrived each Wednesday morning, always in that same red jacket, always with that same sad, serious expression. But the cadets learned to see past the worn clothing and the quiet demeanour. They learned that when the sergeant major spoke, every word carried the weight of experience they couldn't begin to imagine. He taught them to respect their weapons, not as tools of power, but as instruments that demanded constant vigilance. He taught them that the greatest strength wasn't in how fast you could fire, but in how well you could prevent accidents. He shared stories, not of glory, but of mistakes he'd seen, of lives lost to carelessness, of the responsibility they carried every time they picked up a rifle. Marcus Webb became one of his most dedicated students, and eventually one of the finest marksmen in his class. Instructor Daniels, humbled and transformed, began to understand that real expertise was quiet, patient, and built on a foundation of respect for the deadly nature of their profession. Colonel Morrison watched it all with satisfaction, knowing he'd made the right call in reaching out to his old friend. The range culture changed. Accidents dropped to zero. Cadets began to truly understand that their training wasn't about looking tough or impressive. It was about going home alive and bringing their fellow soldiers home alive. And at the centre of it all was an old man in a red jacket, with white hair and a white beard, whose sad, serious eyes had seen too much, but who chose to use that experience to protect the next generation. He never sought recognition. He never asked for special treatment. He simply showed up, did the work, and made sure that what had almost happened that day on Lane 7 would never happen again. The weight he carried didn't disappear, but it found purpose. The silence he'd maintained for years found voice in teaching, and the respect he'd never demanded for himself became the foundation of everything he taught others. Thomas Hayes proved that true authority doesn't come from rank or volume or ego. It comes from knowledge earned through experience, from wisdom gained through loss, from the quiet certainty of someone who knows the cost of failure. He proved that you should never judge someone by their worn jacket or their age or their silence, because sometimes the person who looks most ordinary carries the most extraordinary depth. Sometimes the one who speaks softest has the most important things to say, and sometimes the old man they tried to turn away at the gate is exactly the person everyone needs most.